Thank you for being here. It's a great pleasure to introduce the last session of the Ends of Nature conference that Jonathan Aguirre and Marina Bedran with her colleagues from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese organized so beautifully, so powerfully. And my name is João Bill. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology, also at the Woodrow Wilson School. And I am the co-director, together with Pedro Meira Monteiro, of the Brazil Lab, Luso-Afro-Brazilian Studies, which is helping to organize this wonderful conference, also supported by the Program in Latin American Studies, the Princeton Environmental Institute, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and the Lewis Center for the Arts. Mineral, the word, the paper, the poetry, it is possible not to write. Words from João Cabral de Melo Neto, the Brazilian poet, who speaks of some of the themes that have been brought up and addressed in the conference. How to speak about the human, how to speak about nature, how to speak about possible horizons in these times of extinction, in these dark political times. The poetry, it is possible not to write. Maybe if we are capable of receiving that, it might make us more porous to elsewheres and otherwises. And I think no one like Eduardo Khan has been in touch with that poetry it's possible not to write. His incredible work in how forests think toward an anthropology beyond the human has shattered canonical knowledges, orthodoxies, powers that would want to be in various disciplines, including our own anthropology. And it is a great pleasure and honor to have Eduardo Khan, who teaches at McGill University as the keynote speaker of the Ends of Nature. Eduardo has been concerned in his ethnographic work in Ecuador with human, animal, plant relations, and how that attention, ethnographic attention, long-term engagement with the senses, with peoples, with environments, with the unknown, can recast analytics and at the same time provide us, hopefully, with a different sense of the political and the ethical. So it's a great honor to have Eduardo with us today. And the way we will proceed, Eduardo will speak about his new research for his new book, and then he will share a soundscape with us in darkness. The poetry, it's possible not to write, and then some lights will come up, and I will share some comments, ask some initial questions, but we really want to open it to you, to all of you who have been here today, who are coming for this session to share your comments and insights. So let's give Eduardo our warmest welcome to Princeton.
It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak after so many wonderful talks today. I too want to thank Jonathan and Marina for making this happen, and João for being so generous and agreeing to facilitate a conversation around this work. So yeah, what I want to do now is I want to give about a 40-minute paper, relatively standard academic paper, and then I want to transition and have us here in darkness as much as possible, a 10-minute soundscape. I know it's been an exciting but also long day, so bear with me. Okay, so I'm here concerned with the ends of nature in two senses of the word end. I'm going to be arguing that learning to live well today in the shadow of the end of nature, as we know it, will involve finding ways to think with the kinds of ends that nature manifests. Speaking only somewhat more specifically, nature, of course, as we know, is a very complicated and complex and problematic term. I ask, what kinds of ends might those worlds I call forests suggest? And how can they guide us as we face the current specter of planet-wide ecological destruction? I approach this question as an anthropologist, that is, as someone who's committed to cultivating forms of radical listening as I move among modes of being that can at times dissolve me in my quest to understand what I am, who I am, amid a larger flow of life that vastly exceeds me. My goal here is to use what I might thus learn to help find an orientation for us humans in our attempts to live well in relation to the many kinds of others that make and hold us. So insofar as I'm concerned with forests' vast networks of emergent relations among beings, both visible and invisible, this is an ecological project. Insofar as I'm aimed to explore what forests can tell us about what this kind of life more generally is, this is an ontological project. Ontologically speaking, this is an exploration into the oneness from which we emerge and that emerges with us. As such, mine is a metaphysical claim of monism. That is, I hold that differences are second to oneness. They are not metaphysically prior. I'm also making here an epistemological claim, namely that we can, in a variety of registers, some formal, others much more personal, come to know and feel this oneness. Inasmuch as my interest is in learning from these living forests a modality of care and conduct that can guide us as we make our lives beside and find our proper place among the living, the dead, those that may not neatly fit these categories and those yet to come, this is an ethical project. Insofar as I'm committed to collaboratively finding concrete ways to allow this living forest to be a continuing source of guidance, this is also a political project. As an anthropologist, I immerse myself in this exploration through the one method that is both unique to my field and available to anyone, ethnography. By ethnography, I refer to a set of technologies for slowing down and liberating thought through a deep and sustained engagement with and attention to a place and the ways of thinking, human as well as non-human, it holds. This engagement is undertaken with a view to understanding how the kind of thinking that emerges ethnographically displaces and deforms the ways I customarily think, with the additional goal of doing conceptual and practical work with that transformation. Moving among different and seemingly disparate modes of thought makes anthropology a form of shamanism. As such, its aim is to find the emergent frame that might unite these modes in the face of common concerns. This then also makes this project a diplomatic one, perhaps in Bruno Latour's terms, a form of cosmic diplomacy. The place that holds my ethnographic attention is Ecuador's quote-unquote mega-diverse tropical rainforest. It began over 25 years ago with my research in and around the Quechua-speaking Runa village of Avila in Ecuador's northwest Amazon region, and continues today in a much more collaborative vein with the Quechua people of Sarayaku and the Zapara Nation. These are two neighboring communities in Ecuador's vast and forested south-central Amazon region, whose inhabitants, up to now, have concertedly, creatively, and successfully resisted the incursion of large-scale extractive industries, logging, roads, and colonization. These communities are cosmopolitan in every sense of the term. Not only are some of their members highly adept at moving in worldly circles, systematically developing sophisticated political and media campaigns, reaching out to Hollywood movie stars and world leaders ranging from popes to presidents, but their efforts to propose another way of living well are also guided by a deep conceptual engagement with the polity of beings, including especially spirits, of that vast world, the cosmos, that they call a forest. Sacha in Quechua, Naku in Zapara. My current collaborative work involves as well a vibrant community of Ecuadorian lawyers, artists, environmentalists and intellectuals who are also connected to these communities and are deeply concerned and committed to the forest, its people, human and non-human, and their various rights. This ethnographic exploration has also somewhat unexpectedly led me to create an experimental archaeological museum in Quito, concerned with a collection of shamanic figures primarily from the pre-Hispanic Ecuadorian coast. This museum seeks with Amazonian help to anachronistically capacitate an archaic form of animism for our times, recognizing that a central problem of our current geological epoch that we are increasingly calling the Anthropocene is time itself. All of these projects are part of a larger one whose goal is to develop technologies for opening us to the spirit life that emerges with and is expressed by the kind of world that is a thinking forest, and to find there a form of guidance that can be practically implemented today. Thinking forests. The foundation for this ethical and political project is the research that culminated in my book, How Forests Think. That book is an ontological and diplomatic undertaking. It aims to make an ontological claim that forests indeed think, and to do the diplomatic work of showing how this simultaneously distorts, revitalizes, and unites in ways that are sometimes surprising Western scientific and Amazonian animistic understandings of life. I here only briefly summarize some of the claims in that book. My concern here is less with the claims as such, although of course making them in a robust way is important to me. Rather, I'm interested in capacitating the counterintuitive properties of thought that a thinking forest expresses. So a thinking forest is not a metaphor. When I say that forests think, I mean that life is mind. What is distinctive about forests and the beings that compose them is that they robustly exhibit and express mental dynamics. Our Western metaphysics tends to arrogate mind-like phenomena, thought, language, culture, souls, spirits, etc., to humans or our anthropomorphic gods. The claim here, by contrast, is that living dynamics also think, and that this thinking becomes so well expressed and amplified in a complex species-rich tropical forest that it becomes readily available for further thinking. So life thinks, but what then is thought? My argument is that it's something both larger than and different from what we usually take thought to be when we understand it only in terms of human thought. In a somewhat more technical language, my argument is that what makes thought a distinctive dynamic in the universe is its representational quality. Thoughts in the living beings that think them are the outcomes of a process by which, in philosopher Charles Peirce's terms, quote, something stands to somebody for something in some respect or capacity, unquote. This representational dynamic involves signs and can be termed semiotic, and those sign-using somebodies who are wholly made by such signs are selves or minds, or in another idiom, souls, spirits, or persons, regardless of species. All evolutionary dynamics are mental dynamics. They are the only dynamics in the universe through which, regardless of substrate, be it Terran or Martian, something comes to represent that which it is not, with some sort of increasing fit. Life intrinsically thinks. It is synonymous with semiosis. Now, what makes human thought distinctive is the ways in which it thinks through conventional systems of signs, known as symbols. Human language is the clearest example, and its logic forms the basis for so many of the things that we think of as uniquely human, like culture and consciousness. But it's not the only kind of thought out there. Life thinks through different kinds of semiotic modalities. Many of these involve relations of correlation or correspondence. For example, the ways in which a monkey's cry of danger is taken to indicate the presence of a predator. This kind of semiotic dynamic is termed indexical. But underneath this lies another kind of sign process that is important to the life of thought. This one is a bit stranger and in some ways forms the ephemeral foundations for all thought, and as such it has become increasingly important for the way I strive to think with forests. This kind of sign process results from a specifically constrained confusion by which two entities are not distinguished, leading them to be interpreted as one and the same. For example, consider the cryptically camouflaged Amazonian katydid Cycloptera speculata, pictured here. Thanks to its potential predators who did not notice its ancestors, it has, over evolutionary time, come to be invisible, as its members increasingly are confused with the leaves around them. This semiotic modality at play here is termed iconic. So the important thing about iconic, indexical, and symbolic semiotic modalities is that they're nested within each other. Symbolic thinking emerges from and continuously relates to the iconic and indexical thinking that is proper to forests and other such ecologies of selves, as I call them. This means that although symbolic thinking is a distinctively human form and creates thought worlds that are increasingly separable from the world, it is never fully cut off from the non-human forms of thought from which it comes from and on which it depends. Certain kinds of human thought processes, like dreaming, are particularly interesting because they are highly iconic and indexical. And interpreting dreams becomes an important site for a kind of cosmic diplomacy between the vessel that is our waking symbolic thought and the more dark and watery imagistic forms of thought that bears it along. It's no accident that so many Amazonian hunters cultivate dream interpretation as a way to understand the relation to the thinking beings of the forest. And it's no accident that Amazonian concept workers, such as the Yanomami shaman, Davi Kopenama, whom we just heard, locate the problem with whites and Western thought in an inability to dream. The danger of symbolic thought is that because it depends on the creation of a sign system that is relatively separate and independent from the world, it encourages us to see the world dualistically. Our metaphysical mistake is to treat this separation as an absolute ontological reality, instead of understanding it as an emergent effect of a particular kind of sign process. The amplification of this dualism as a form of thinking and as a way of life has resulted in a large group of humans becoming increasingly separate from the world that holds them, to the point that we have become a force of nature in this epoch of human-driven climate change that is increasingly, and to my mind, appropriately being called the Anthropocene. Thinking with the kinds of thoughts that forests produce, what I call sylvan thinking, is a way to put a brake on this kind of dualism. And this is why understanding this way of thinking is so important. I here wish to briefly highlight just a few of the elements of sylvan thinking that get amplified in a forest in ways that can then become harnessed as a mode of thought for thinking for our times. The first involves ens, or telos. The emergence of semiosis in the universe also marks the emergence of end-directed phenomena. With life, there emerges a self that comes to represent something for the sake of its future self. This is a minimal but real locus of telos. The second involves absence. As Gregory Bateson put it, in the world of mind, that which is not can be a cause. That is, representation, wherever on this planet it is found, involves processes through which that which is not present physically can nonetheless acquire a kind of causal efficacy. This essential quality, as Terry Deacon calls it, changes what we mean when we think of being and doing. The third concerns images, or iconism. Forests think in pictures, and harnessing the effortless, counterintuitive, and self-organizing efficacy of forms and patterns, and their echoes, I should add, through which images work, by, for example, cultivating modes of thought, such as dreaming, is one of our best ways to access this. Thinking imagistically is also highly personal. The only way we can have an icon is to feel it for ourselves, which makes this mode of knowing easily open to critique. Tacking between highly personal imagistic thinking and more objective third-person forms of argumentation that are more properly academic is also an aspect of the cosmic diplomacy I seek to practice. Finally, sylvan thinking involves the emergence of generals. We tend to think of the emergence of concepts, more abstract thoughts that join or subsume more specific ones, as something intrinsically human. And this is the foundation of the philosophical position known as nominalism, which holds that categories come from the minds of humans, thinkers, and not from the world beyond them. This is also the foundation for our traditional understanding of culture and social construction. But to return to the Amazonian katydid, with its evolutionary emergence, there's now more leafiness in the world. Leafiness is a real general, and it does not emerge from human minds or cultures. Biological species and lineages also exhibit this sort of general property. And I suggest in my cosmic diplomacy that the forest spirits that are so important to my Amazonian colleagues and to forest life more generally are quite similar in this regard. Forest spirits are highly essential generals that are imagistic expressions of the telos intrinsic to a kind of emergent self that dense thickets of life can produce. In other words, forest spirits make manifest to us nature's ends. Abduction and the continual emergence of mind. So I've talked a little bit about nature's ends, and now let me say something about anthropology's ends. Anthropology's end is to create new concepts with the concepts that are discovered to be at work in the field. Crucially, what I'm after in thinking with forests is to discover the ways in which anthropology's ends, the goal of doing concept work, can be informed and guided by the concepts that emerge as we attend to nature's ends. The kind of concept work I'm after involves arriving at abductions. This is Pearson's term for a third kind of inference, which he took to be a necessary complement to induction and deduction. An abduction, according to Peirce, is the operation of adopting a hypothesis by virtue of an insight that comes to us like a flash. Abduction for Peirce is the only process by which a new element can be introduced into thought. It results in an idea that can unify other and heretofore seemingly disparate ones, and for this reason he saw it as related to the icon. An abduction can eventually be inductively supported, and once established, made to do deductive work. In his discussion of abduction, Peirce was thinking primarily of the kinds of reasoning involved in science and philosophy. But I see abductions as part of what Peirce, in a more capacious vein, referred to as a scientific intelligence, by which he meant any kind of entity, human or non-human, capable of learning by experience. Semiotic life produces abductions. For example, the perception of depth that emerges by juxtaposing what two eyes see is a sort of abduction. It unifies two distinct and somewhat different ways of seeing in such a way that an altogether new way of seeing can emerge. Anthropology's goal is a discipline concerned with developing methods of encounter that shake us into seeing the world anew, is to abductively grasp new concepts that unite prior and seemingly disparate ones in the flash of their emergence. Forests produce concepts. The Runa and other Amazonians produce concepts with these, and I try to do the same with these and others. Being abductively open, so to speak, is what it means to be alive to a living thought. It requires a constant ethos of self-effacement to be available to such thoughts, for we are unwittingly held by the concepts that make us. Ethnography is a technology for loosening the hold that these foundational concepts have on us in order to find a position from which abductions can work on us. That is, we can never impose abductions because as spontaneous moments of holistic emergence, we can never have them. They can, if we let them, only have us as they make over our modes of thought. So it's a form of listening, a patient form of doing. Being alive to the living thought also makes anthropology psychedelic, literally mind manifesting, from the Greek psyche, mind or spirit, and deluon, to make manifest. For this kind of attention to the world can manifest to us mind or self in the quintessence of its selfhood. That is, it can reveal mind in its very mindedness, or in Peirce's terms, in its continuous ability to grow and make itself anew as it lays aside old habits and takes up new ones. Grasping this in the world and in ourselves has the potential to shake up our own psychological sense of self, as well as the one that is formed by a larger solidified set of concepts that hold us. Crucial to anthropological attempts to arrive at another abductively derived emergent metaphysics is a methodological refusal of closure, a refusal to allow the analytical frames we bring to the field to explain everything. The goal of such a refusal is to create a space where new concepts can emerge. Manari Ushigwa, the Sapara political and spiritual leader with whom I work and think closely, understands concepts to be gods. Every time a concept emerges abductively, there also emerges a god. When we come up with a new idea, in the example Manari gives, to create a healing center or a new political organization, this idea is a god. It then takes real political work to ensure that this god becomes actualized. Such general concepts or gods also emerge abductively from the forest. When speaking in Spanish, they are often referred to as spirits, espíritu in Spanish. Note that the French cognate esprit refers both to spirit and mind. Sometimes these have generic names like forest lords, Sacha Amu, or forest people, Sacha Runa. Some are more specific like Yaku, river, Alpa, earth, Waira, wind, and some have proper names like Piazza or Tsamaro. In their constant attempts to be made over by those abductions not of their making, Amazonians adopt a skeptical stance. One is never fully sure of what kind of reality one is in, and what kinds of gods will reveal themselves as one engages with the worlds called forests. The only certainty is that we humans are never alone. What is more, any suspicion that we might be alone is a sure sign that we have become deaf and soon perhaps quite literally dead to the world. I align this skeptical stance with the anthropological refusal of closure, the constant and healthy suspicion that our ways of knowing can be disrupted by understanding other ways of knowing. But skepticism aside, the shamanistic goal is to arrive at a form of understanding that will have a kind of resolution. Amazonians may spend a day anxiously unsure of how to interpret the vivid dream they had the night before, but when its juxtaposition with an event in everyday life suddenly reveals that dream's meaning, that is, when dream thought and waking thought come together in the abductive emergence of a new thought that unites them as one, there is holistic closure. Skepticism is part of the necessary path that thoughts take. Critique, however, is not where thought begins or ends. I am after an emergent metaphysics that will abductively unite the human and natural sciences with each other, and these with what forests and those who dwell there can teach us in a way that can become the font for another way of living well. As such, this metaphysics will be a monist one. A psychedelic science. Achieving anthropology's ends of doing concept work with the concepts that the world manifests requires the cultivation of certain technologies of ethnographic immersion. Ethnography, then, as a method for abductively open concept work, is a psychedelic science. As such, it lends itself well to resonate with a mind-manifesting forest. Now, what a thinking forest manifests is mind's manifestation in the form of spirit. In the process, forests also manifest a scientific intelligence in the Peircean sense. That is, they manifest how they are made of dynamics through which learning by experience is constantly taking place. The scientific method, with its form of hypothesis testing designed to mimic evolution, is a technology for thinking with the scientific intelligence already operant in places like forests. But there are other scientific technologies, modes of learning by experience as well. Amazonian dream interpretation and plant-induced visionary experiences are other such technologies. Their great advantage is that in their privileging of non-human semiotic registers, they already think the way psychedelic forests think. Anthropology's challenge is to cultivate technologies to align our thinking with this kind of thinking, making it a kind of science that can manifest the mindedness emergent in the worlds I call forests. Central to our ability to appreciate the manifestation in us of this kind of mind is the dissolution of the little minds, our social, culturally determined individual ones, held as they are by so many layers of personal and collective traumas, histories, and assumptions. I now turn to psychedelic technologies that are more specific to the Upper Amazon, as a way to shed light on some of the contours of that anthropology as a scientific, as a way to shed light on some of the contours that anthropology as a psychedelic science might take. In his eclectic book Pharmacopoeia, endorsed by none other than the beat poet Allen Ginsberg, Dale Pendle distinguishes between those kinds of medicines given to patients and those that doctors take. And I'm going to focus here on the latter. By doctors, Pendle had in mind shamans. The Quechua term is yachak, literally knower. And in this sense, it's not so different from the PhD-wielding doctors we strive to be, whose aim is to diagnose those all-too-human ailments that also make us. Amazonian shamans are expressly tasked with doing concept work by moving among worlds, especially between spirit and everyday ones. in ways that can affect something, be it a cure or in darker registers, a curse. They are cosmic diplomats. Shamans are sometimes referred to in Quechua as miriku, which is a Quechuazation of the Spanish word médico, the Spanish word for doctor. Miriku plays on a bilingual pun. Riku means seer in Quechua, one who sees. Code switching between languages is also a kind of shamanism that abductively brings into view the ways in which a shamanic doctor uses medicines to see how a holistic world emerges from the fragmented experiences of multiple worlds. Now, Pendle thinks of these medicines that doctors ingest as poisons. It is interesting to note that in Quechua, the word hambi refers both to poisons, like what you use to tip blowgun darts, and remedies. These medicines are potentially deadly. They can threaten the organismic life of the doctors who take them in our attempts to dissolve the lives of the little selves that have accreted like husks around us. This makes such medicines radically other to us, and our relationship to them is more properly one of alliance rather than one of brotherly friendship. Medicines in this sense are potentially, in Donna Haraway's terms, oddkin. Their use involves cultivating an intimate relationship that always threatens the conceptual grounds from which we strive to relate. Difference is the road to oneness. These medicines force us to confront a sort of skepticism external to us, one that is experienced as alterity. That is, these medicines are, again, to use Haraway's term, tricksters. Ethnographically speaking, the poisoned medicines I have in mind are tobacco. The nicotine extraction from one cigar would, if injected, be lethal. The more properly speaking psychedelic decoction ayahuasca, literally the vine huasca of the dead, aya, and the alkaloid-rich paralysis-inducing deadly nightshade wantuk, which is considered essential to proper shamanic initiation in the Upper Amazon, and whose toxicity, for this risk-averse anthropologist, makes it too dangerous to even consider exploring. So I want to talk a bit about ayahuasca, which has become, along with tobacco and dream interpretation, central to the psychedelic technologies I, in partnership with my oddkin brother Manari Ushigwa, am cultivating as we seek to develop methods for using representational technologies, especially writing, but also drawing, sound recordings, photography, and video, as ways that can express how the spirit life manifested by forests can be a source of guidance. It's one thing to venture to speak about something like ayahuasca. It's quite another to feel, as I did one particularly terrifying night in Manari's community, my human flesh peeling away as I became nothing more than a yawning jaguar's throat channeling the forest's cosmic life force, a tube-like conduit for the life that was flowing through a me that no longer existed in any embodied form I could recognize as my own. Taking ayahuasca seems to break down our symbolically structured sense of self. Every part of who we are as humans, insofar as this identity is held symbolically, dissolves. It is this self that must, for a time at least, die in order for a new one to emerge. With the death of that old self, we are open to the many other non-symbolic forms of thought that our previous selves occlude. When we come back to ourselves, we do so having become abductively open to a larger ecology of selves that we can now recognize as intrinsic to the more capacious and ever-emerging self we really are and might continue to be. It's no surprise that psychiatrists are administering psychedelics to treat depression. If depression is the result of a process by which the self has become stultified by the endless recycling of the past in ways that limit our futures, a process that results in an alienation from the relatively more entropic mental states that allow us to feel the possibility of our own continual living emergence, then psychedelics certainly seem to offer an opening. But I want to think about psychedelics as medicine in a broader sense as well, for they hold the possibility not just to reveal and rekindle our own mind's manifestation, life itself in all of its emergent possibility, but they also allow us to see that emerging mind, our own, as part of the larger mind of a thinking forest, manifesting itself as spirit. Now let me be absolutely clear. I'm too much of a critically minded anthropologist to proffer exotic drug use as a self-help cure-all. Our remedies, medicinal and especially otherwise, will need to be homegrown. And yet psychedelics can teach us something about the logical contours of the technologies we need to develop as we seek cures for planetary depression that is associated with the humanism that is one of humanity's toxic byproducts. I am then ultimately concerned with the question of anthropology's ends in the more pressing sense to which this gestures. As we face the unprecedented threat of whole-scale human-driven ecological destruction at a planetary level, the continuing life of thinking forests and the thoughts that emerge from them is what is at stake. My claim is that the thinking forest with which we can learn to think can provide their own form of ethical guidance for living in the Anthropocene, and that anthropology, the study of the human, is in a unique position to address this. My title, Forest for the Trees, points to this challenge. Alluding to and tweaking the old adage that we are missing the forest for the trees, I claim that that emergent general assemblage of living thoughts called a forest can have something to say for the good of trees. The word missing is missing from my title, but I hope to do work with its absential resonances. For the time we live in is marked politically and psychically by two things. First, a denial of the recognition that we are living with an impending ecological crisis. And second, a refusal to see how the worlds I call forests might provide a kind of spirit guidance as we face this crisis. It's also marked by a temporal anxiety, marked by the sensation that we are missing the moment when we can still do something about the impending ecological, by which I also mean in its broadest sense, social catastrophe that we earthbound creatures are currently facing. This is coupled by the uneasy feeling that our time is somehow out of whack with other kinds of temporalities, geological and otherwise, with which it intersects at this moment. Now, my title refers to trees in all of their woody sentience, but also by extension to the broader collectives or societies of beings that both give rise to forests and are held, sustained, and guided by them. We are all trees, and all us tree-like creatures have a forest, by which I mean spirit aspect to us. To think with forests and to continually ask ourselves what good those thoughts that come from forests are for, this is an anthropological problem because it's a human one. We humans are the ones who must continually cultivate the art of listening to forests. This is what it would mean to ecologize thought. And it is we, humans, many of us at least, who have stopped listening. Now, the Amazonians I work with are less concerned with the ontological question of whether or not forest spirits exist, and more concerned with the ethical question of how to listen to them. For there are good ones and bad ones, helpful ones and those that are downright dangerous, and activating the right ones requires care, knowledge, and wisdom. Ethics, our understandings of how to conduct ourselves, is usually seen to be grounded either in human nature or, for social scientists, in the sets of socially constructed historical contexts that give meaning to certain forms of comportment. Now, without denying these dimensions, I hold that ethics has ontological tendrils that reach into the non-human world. That is, if we humans and our thoughts form part of a larger thinking world that holds us, then our modes of conduct must also emerge from and be guided by this fact. Ethics then has a footing in the non-human world. First, because the orientation of conduct based on the discernment of good and bad stands in a relationship of emergent continuity to the value intrinsically and uniquely expressed by semiotic life. For it is only with the emergence of life that one can say that there's something good or bad for the living self in question, and thus intrinsic to its mode of being. And second, because I also think that there is a way to actually discern at least some of the contours of an ethics in the imagistic thinking that forests produce. Regarding the latter, Charles Peirce suggested that we should understand the philosophical study of ethics to be nested within a broader field of inquiry concerned with the ways in which the ontological properties of the world that manifest itself to us relate to ends. For Peirce, the end of ethics proper is the discernment of a moral good that results in an action. But just as for Peirce, the logic of an indexical sign is nested within that of an icon, he took this kind of ethical good to be nested within and growing out of a larger whole that holds it. This whole for Peirce is something he called the aesthetic good, whose end is not an action, but a feeling. What counts as beautiful or aesthetically good for Peirce has a formal resemblance to an icon. Remember that icons involve an interpretive process by which entities that might otherwise be distinguished are seen to be the same. Recall also that this is the basis for an abduction, the inferential process by which a general concept suddenly arises to unify seemingly disparate ones. Regarding the aesthetic, Peirce writes that, quote, an object, to be aesthetically good, must have a multitude of parts so related to one another as to impart a positive, simple, immediate quality to their totality, unquote. It's my contention that Amazonian animistic and shamanistic modes of thought also grounds the ethical in aesthetics in the attempts to discern a mode of conduct from the general concepts or spirits that emerge from the forest. This involves immersing oneself in the free-form play of highly entropic thought via dreaming and other psychedelic technologies, such that a holistic image can emerge that can then serve as a guide for conduct, and thus shares formal properties in common with what Peirce called the aesthetic good. So that may be a little abstract, but let me just illustrate it with an example, a concrete example. Last year, Manati was in Montreal to take part in a research project in bringing Indigenous leaders and academics together to discuss issues of territorial and environmental conflict. As part of his visit, Lisa Stevenson and I organized a workshop where we screened an experimental film by the Quebecois artist Philippe Léonard. The film was about the 2016 Fort McMurray fire in Alberta, which burned close to 1.5 million acres of forest. Philippe was there during the fire and made a powerful film, one that to my mind went directly into Sylvan thought. Without context or explanation, it used images to lead one directly into what it feels like to be a forest under assault, and also to feel the infernal quasi-agential forces responsible for its devastation. So I wanted to hear Manati's thoughts about this film because I took it to be an instance of image manifesting spirit in the context of environmental destruction. Now, Manati's reaction before the audience we assembled made me realize just how inadequate my ontological curiosity was. The film, he told us, provoked in him a sense of becoming literally disembodied. He felt one of his arms flying off across the screening room in one direction, another in the opposite direction. He felt his head floating above, his legs dispersing below. Now, this appears to be the exact opposite of what Peirce calls the aesthetic good. For Peirce, recall, the aesthetic good is the result of an emergent image in which parts come together to form a larger whole. In focusing exclusively on the ontological as such, I had missed the ethical. For Manati, the film was conjuring real spirits, the ontological, but in a bad way, because they were breaking itself into pieces and thus impeding his ability as emissary of the forest spirits to make manifest in himself a kind of larger self that can guide us. Manati's work, of course, does not stop with the ethical. For actualizing the ethical, translating concepts into actions takes real political work. In Sarayaku and Sapara territories, this necessarily involves finding ways in which the spirit world, can guide struggles to organize against constant encroachments by government-sanctioned extractive exploration, and all of the nefarious ways in which that makes itself manifest, from shamanic attacks, arsons, beatings, and death threats to interactions with shady company-employed community relations personnel, which are just things that have happened in the last few weeks or months. For Manati and other Amazonian concept workers, it also involves the complex process of working with these concepts in national and international legal and political contexts that draw on their own concepts with the goal of objectively discovering their own role as cosmic diplomats in articulating local concerns as expressions of planetary problems. So just by way of a very short conclusion, Forest for the Trees is an attempt to channel a spirit guidance that emerges from the dense ecologies of cells that hold and make each and every one of us. As such, I am not its author. I, along with others such as Manati and other Amazonian concept workers, are striving to find the technologies and idioms through which forest mind can become manifest through us. The end of this endeavor is to find practical ways to allow Sylvan thought's endless dynamic of end-making and unmaking to continue to have a life. If this is a worthy endeavor, it's because it is faithful to something about us in our world that we already know. So that's the formal talk. I want to just take a couple of minutes to frame the soundscape I'd like you to hear, and then we can hear the sounds, Thank you. So I just want to frame this very briefly, and then we'll hear this, and then we can I don't know. Then the other shaman in the room can guide us. So I want to hear one of many shamans in the room, I should say. We're all shamans. I mean that seriously. So I want to switch gears now so that we can enter this world I call force through a different register. The seeds of this were planted when I was a small child, 10 years old. And my grandmother, Costanza di Capua, was an Italian Jewish refugee to Quito, Ecuador. She was an amateur archaeologist who amassed a collection of pre-Hispanic shamanic figures from coastal Ecuador. And these captivated me as a child, and they are the reason why I became an anthropologist. After she died, I worked hard to help get that collection safely donated to a museum where it could be safe, and I consider my responsibility to the pieces fulfilled. Years later, just recently, I found myself in Manari's community, Llanchamacocha, taking ayahuasca as part of our goal of writing a document that would channel what the forest spirits wanted to tell the world about the forest. So we were kind of developing a kind of strange set of technologies for thinking with forests that involves psychedelic explorations, but also representational explorations. So that night, I had a vision of my grandmother swooping in on the back of a giant cobalt-winged jaguar. Then I saw a blank-eyed figure, just like the one I'd seen years before in my grandmother's collection. And I realized that my work with the collection was not over. And I realized that I needed to create an exhibit that would actually allow, curate a museum exhibit that would allow these archaic figures to speak via an Amazonian portal. It seemed to me that these pieces, which as we all know were unceremoniously ripped out of the ground for the benefit of collectors, and that violence, of course, is a mere aftershock of the forces that destroyed the densely peopled forest worlds from which they emerged. It seemed to be that nonetheless, or because of that violence, they might somehow anachronistically have something to say for a time in which time itself is out of joint. So this became a project that increasingly Manari and I began working together. And as part of this, last year, along with the Ecuadorian sound artist Fabiano Cueva and the musician Ruben Silva, we got permission and took 50 instruments to the Amazon, from Quito to the Amazon, to Manari's community, with the goal of making a soundscape for the museum, which would allow visitors to feel for themselves a kind of guidance from the spirit life of the forest. We played the instruments in ceremonies, by the river, in the forest at night. At one point, the instruments even attracted the rarest of forest mammals, the Amazonian short-eared bush dog, which hardly any biologists have ever seen. All sorts of other strange things happened, including the birth of a child engendered by the flutes. Since then, guided by Manari, we've continued, just to show a couple of these slides. Since then, guided by Manari, we've continued to make recordings and have been editing the soundscape based on, this is just from a couple months ago, based on aesthetic principles that are shamanic in nature, with the goal of capacitating these beings as guides for our times. So this is what I'd like you to listen to now. So maybe we can just, Jonathan can maybe help me, and if we can also just turn off this light. There's nothing to film now, so we'll just listen. And I just turn off critique for a little bit. You can turn it back on later, but just see what can happen if you kind of just allow yourself to listen.
dâu na cánh đa na cây ta la ta ta tâm ta châu cây ta su ma tri tu tài ba du cánh đà du dây su ma ta lại ba cánh cây ta xuống ta vô dân ta vô ta tài ba du dân ta tám ba câu tây ô ma ta ma tây dâu na cánh đa ya chạy kinh đi đi na văn tài ba câu tây ta đi ta bài ba yên ba câu tây ta cầu tình ta tây ta ya tình ta đi ta ba du ya ta ba du ya ya tình ta tình ma ta ni ta tài ba câu tây tung mà câu tây dây tam
some of the things that I scribbled here, like in free association, there might be some questions built in there, or maybe there is some reawakened critique. As you said,
Yeah.
critique is on,
Critique is back on.
but definitely the static experiment is also there, permeating, my sensibility and my response to you. You mentioned, and that's one of the expressions that you use, ecologizing thought. And I wonder, how would you relate that to the process of decolonizing thought? If you can make any, if it's on purpose, that you're playing with that or not. I'm thinking, for example, of the work of Mike Tausig, right? Who work, in the near the area where you work, and his own work with ayahuasca, for example, and shamanism, colonialism, and the wild man. And there seems to be an effort there to decolonize thought. And I think built in this pairing of decolonizing thought and ecologizing thought might be the question then of political economy, which plays such a crucial role in Tausig's decolonizing thought. So I wonder where do you see yourself vis-a-vis that project, a more Tausian project of decolonization of thought? How does political economy figure in this ecologization of thought, right? Or critique of political economy. The other big point that you made is, and it's an important one, of the self dying, the death of the self, right? The end of the subject. And when you brought that up in an unusually fast turn in the narrative, because you were so well paced, and it was a poem. You recited a poem to us, but all of a sudden it was the only moment that I felt it was a bit jarring when you said the cure for planetary depression. It was very jarring, that transition, and you seem to suggest that humanitarianism, a certain humanitarian thought or humanitarianism, was part of that sickness of the planet, so to speak. So if you could talk us a little bit about that transition from the end of the subject to the cure of the planetary depression. It was a bit jarring for me, that transition. When you talked about the inability to dream, I was reminded of Nietzsche's beautiful text, one of his earliest texts on the use and abuse of history from 1874, where he says, we suffer from this historical fever, right? In Germany, he was making a diagnosis of Germany at that time, really kind of like a teleological sense of the subject, a sense of, being part of ancient culture, and, the lived didn't matter anymore, because there was already a sense of being a cultured subject from the get-go. And he basically says, of course we need certain doses of history, but we also need the unhistorical. The unhistorical is fundamental, be it through religion, through art, for us to be able to draw an horizon around ourselves. And without that capacity of drawing an horizon around oneself, life cannot exist, or health cannot exist. So I was thinking a little bit about, and that's an idea that Adriana Petrina, in her work on horizoning work, as she calls it, in the face of climate change, abrupt climate change. I wonder how you see this question of drawing an horizon around oneself, the unhistorical. So if the first question was a bit about the political economy, the colonialism, the historical, maybe this question is, unpack a little bit more about this unhistorical, because the unhistorical emerges in your narrative through the ayahuasca.
Unhistorical?
The unhistorical. Yeah. It emerges in the ayahuasca. But I'm thinking about the common man and woman who don't partake in those rituals. Which kind of horizons do they draw around themselves? Or does the shamanic, does the artistic, does the aesthetic do the work for them? And what's that? which kind of outsourcing is that? But I'm curious about people's everyday capacity of arisoning. The forest for the trees. And I was thinking about the title because that's the only thing I got from you beforehand to prepare. The forest for the trees. That's what I had. So to prepare my comments. And then I love the expression. And then I thought, what can I do that moves me intensely as of late? And the thing that moved me the most in the past year was a visit to the Amazon, guided by a shaman, Beto Verissimo, the environmentalist, who is sitting in the back, who is with us at Princeton for several weeks, who works in this wonderful organization called Amazon, which really is monitoring deforestation and at the same time trying to bring that evidence to public prosecutors, judges, that can act on that, and their work has been quite effective in at least slowing down the rates of deforestation in the Amazon. But he also works with his organization, and he works with local communities, indigenous communities, riverbank communities, but also communities of descendants of runaway slaves who live deep into the Amazon, the Quilombolas. And we were fortunate to visit one of those communities. And we had a chance to talk to the patriarch, if not the shaman, of that community in Ariramba, 78 years old, Joaquin. Pedro and Andrea were with us, Adriana and Andre, and he sat with us and I collected his story, which ended up being like a myth of creation of sorts of that community. And it was very interesting because the way he introduced the characters from INCRA, the Colonization, Agrarian Reform Institute of Brazil, FUNAI, the organization that supposedly protect indigenous communities, but also Petrobras, the oil company, right, who was there in the forest digging holes, etc. And then he basically made the point, I worked in the forest, I hunted jaguars. That was my job for 8 years to make my living, to raise my family. And he said, I stopped when we moved here and I got land, right? And then in the narrative, which is very elliptic, it moves back and forth, after he says that, they had to do so much documentation, so many papers, they need to have an anthropologist to show they were truly quilombolas. And after that, the narrative shifts and it becomes very psychedelic, very hallucinatory in the modality of speaking, where he then all of a sudden sees a waterfall in the forest, and then like a mirror-like reflection, and then it becomes this forest inhabited by spirits, and then the struggle between snakes. So in some ways, the forest emerges once they have land, and land that he can then live behind for his children, right? The next day, the 78-year-old man would, he and his wife would give birth to 2 daughters, 2 twins. So my question then is, right, forest for trees, how do you think about land, ownership of land, territory, ownership of land, So we saw the communities mobilizing, right? So they're mobilizing, for the forests, for the spirits, as you say, right? But what about that concrete mobilization for land? And is that not a fundamental condition for the forest and the spirits to exist?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think before we go any further, I should try to answer these things.
Yes.
Let's see if I can, let me put this over here. This is the beginning of a great conversation. It's a continuation of one, because these are questions that you've also raised and pushed me on in the past, especially regarding Taussig and political economy, ecologizing thought, and its relation to decolonizing thought. I'm making an important claim here, and I think this is a claim that one thing I should be clear about in this paper is based on a kind of ethnography that is not so present here. And the ethnography is really following people around in concrete struggles and understanding how what they're doing is responding to concrete struggles that have a history. So the Zapata Nation was 10,000 people strong until the rubber boom, and was really largely decimated by Peruvian rubber incursions. And they see themselves as a remnant or as a last emissaries of a basic. They are kind of a sense that they're experiencing their own extinction and are doing something from that position. Ecologizing thought is a form of decolonizing thought. I don't think those things are opposite, especially taking seriously what people there are doing when they're trying to bring this kind of thinking into politics. So the claim of forest for trees, and this is the claim that Manati and others are also making, is that this realm of the spirit is not just some sort of feel-good thing. This is the essential realm through which one must connect to do political work, and entering into that in order to do political work is what they're doing, and that's what I'm trying to trace out in the everyday battles and skirmishes that are happening on the ground in their territory as they bring it to the places like COP21 Climate Summit in Paris, to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, places where I'm increasingly participating as well. So I think it's really important to recognize that these things are not separate things, and they are, constant. And I think the claim about this is that I don't think it's elitist to demand to be able to cultivate technologies of sensing one's sense of emergence. And I think many people can do it in different ways. And there are many everyday common ways of doing it. And my slide of an image of an Ontario spring, in a scruffy forest, is that kind of spirit life is here as well, and many other kinds of places. And the point about this, there's something about the kind of anthropology that I do that is in some ways, from some points of view, a certain anthropology of the extreme. But the idea is not to romanticize the extreme or advocate that as some sort of thing, but to actually learn something about what becomes more clearly visible in that space. So I'm not saying everyone should take psychedelics. I'm saying that psychedelics allow us to see something that can be cultivated in many, many other ways. But it shows us, it's a form of study right now. It's a form of seeing something. It also happens to be an ethnographic reality. People do use this for these reasons. I don't know, the self, I'm not sure what, I want to think carefully about what I'm doing narratively and what's going on with what things I brush over too quickly. But I do, I sense maybe part of coming out of my own personal, a lot of times I write things that seem to be about something that's really about me. I have an insight which seems to resonate with psychiatrists I'm also hanging out with who are using psychedelics in their work to treat depression, that there's something about this kind of, you have to somehow psychically die to hold on, to let go of some things, to be able to be open to others. And I think it's a kind of scalable thing. It's, this is about the kind of the others in our everyday relationships, our partners, our family, our friends, our colleagues, but it's also these other kinds of others that are the forest beings and things like that. So I'm trying to make some, I guess I still need to work on how to make that more fluid, but those are all connected. I think, a little bit about just the comment on Nietzsche and the horizons. The idea of breaking down the self is not to just be naked is not to completely disavow all one's identity. In fact, Manati what Manati said to me, and it remains a crucial part of the way I approach this, is to say, when you come into this relationship with we're trying to cultivate this relationship with forest spirits, you first have to ask yourself who you are, and who that I am is part of a larger emergent us. That is us with the saparas, with the forest. And in another paper that I've been giving, I talk about many of these examples by which we actually recognize our strange, odd kinship from this relationship that began 40 or 50 years ago, even though we haven't met it, we only just recently met each other. So the point here, the point just to get to the thing is that in this sense of this, the sense that I feel that the sort of indicator of a life that is a good life is this sense this ability to be able to connect with the emergence that you are part of. That's what would indicate the life of a forest. That would indicate the life of an individual. And I think that is readily available, and it must be made available to everyone. And it would, it's another register. It's on which to envision what living well would be. And finally, the question of land. There's a very complicated way in which all of these struggles are linked to real politics, and they also deform real politics. So the reason why these people have 1.5 million hectares of land, this area, which is someplace between 1 and 3 million hectares of land, has to do with very interesting and important indigenous politics that happened in the 90s in Ecuador, in which they were able to get a kind of titling from the government through a series of very traditional protests, blocking up roads and very interesting things, where these communities were absolutely central to it. What's happening now is that they're sort of in a second generation. Although they are, they're very, this could not be done without having land titling. They're also recognizing the limits and the limits of the concept of land and territory as a kind of a naturalist mode of thought. And in fact, one of the things I've been working closely with the Sadayaku community is something that they call Kausaksacha, which is it's called a concept that they're developing, which is called Kausaksacha, or the living forest. And it's actually a concrete proposal to recognize another form of legal, recognize land or territory in a completely different way, not as property, but as basically what happens when, if you actually accept that forests are made up entirely of selves that have to be treated relationally, what kind of law would ensue from that? And they're actually trying to do this. So again, the point of decolonizing and ecologizing thought, they are taking, it's not enough for them to say, okay, we don't have land, we need territory, right? They're saying, we obviously need to protect this space and ability to live, but we're gonna transform the concepts we're going to ecologize and decolonize the concepts under which the assumption that land is what people think it is. But of course, we need to have the sort of base to do that as well, and that's the space of real practical politics, which is part of this project as well.
Okay, thank you, Eduardo. So let's collect a few questions. So we can collect bundles. We have about 40 minutes, and then afterwards, I want to remind everyone there's a wonderful reception at the program Latin American Studies at the atrium in the 3rd floor, Aaron Burr. So we have, yes, and Marilia and...
It's for the video.
For the technique, yes. Okay. Let's collect 3 or 4 questions, and then Eduardo will respond.
A 101 question. Can you walk us through whether for those images that I guess are drawings of visions that you had, or through the soundscape? I would assume that the sounds we hear here are in an iconic relationship to the sounds that took place in the jungle, but are also in an indexical relationship in such a way that we can claim then that here today we have been touched by the forest itself, in spite of the distance. Can you walk us through the semiosis of that? And another literary question. In what ways, for coming up to that writing that will be through which the forest will speak, are you changing habits about writing? Is taking you to think writing in a different way?
Okay, Marilyn? Yeah.
Sorry. This takes me a while.
Okay. So thank you very much. It was fantastic. Thank you very much. So I have a question that's related to what Jorge just said, and what we were talking sooner about iconic images, and what you said at the beginning as your search for a radical form of listening. So it seems that all the images you saw here, the photos, but also the drawings, have this quality of reverberation and blurring aspect. And so my question is, between the visible and the invisible, can you tell us a little bit about the knowledge from dreaming? So we know that dreams works basically or fundamentally with images, iconic images. Do you have reports or narratives about dreamings, listening in dreamings in your technologies that you are experiencing over there? And the second point is, you said difference is the road to oneness, right? Oneness.
Right, yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yes. So I understand this as this belonging with these multiple differences in the world of the forests and beyond. And how about, if you can also elaborate about no one, in the sense of the sense of belonging can also be the disappearing of one entity and becoming multiple with the diversity. So escaping the one.
Then we have someone in front. Yeah. Right.
Hi, thanks. So what can the forest tell us about places on Earth that has no trees, for instance, that have no trees, like the Antarctica, deserts, even like outer space, asteroids, the moon? Is the forest able to tell us something about that? And also, can you tell us about your necklace, if that's relevant?
Yeah.
Maybe not? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. And then we have Victoria here, right? And then we'll go to this side, so to facilitate.
Wait, this is a lot of questions. Don't you
Yeah.
think I should? Do you want to keep
Just
collecting?
one
them?
more, because
Okay.
because many people, so we get a pulse.
Okay,
and
a pulse.
reaction.
Okay, good.
Yes, you get a pulse. You get
Okay.
some. Yeah.
Thank you. Great, too. I have a question that is also related to Jorge's question about the mediated quality of these experiences, and it is more specifically about the use of ayahuasca, because the way you presented it is very clearly connected to to these thinking forests, but there is already a transnational market for the ayahuasca, right? I would risk saying that most of the ayahuasca consumed today is not consumed in specific place of the rainforest, and it is growing a lot, and at least
Like
in
probably there
the
are more plastic jaguars in the world than real jaguars.
yeah,
right?
so all over in the
I'm
United
sure. I mean,
States,
that's
and
just a definite. Yeah.
and but still, if we
but that's
think
not
about,
fair.
I mean, for example, the consumption of ayahuasca in Brazil, for example,
Yeah.
but not in the Amazonian region, like by Santo Daime or União do Vegetal, the centers of these religions are most often in like areas a bit outside, in the outskirts of cities, in which you have some form of like a forested area or some form of countryside.
Yep.
So there's still some form of attempt at connection with what we could think of of a forest that would have a thought of its own, but it would not be the rainforest where the vegetal, the roots came from. So how do we think about this rerootedness?
Yeah.
Could you think about something like a more than human form of transculturation, for example?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, wow, great questions, amazing. Let's start with 101. Yeah, so about just some of the kind of the technical workings of what I'm trying after with images, the soundscapes, the writing technologies. I mean, this sort of gets also at Marila's question a bit. So, you know, I go kind of in and out of certain forms of being able to connect with things. So there was a time, it sort of seems to have dried up right now, but I was doing a lot of drawing. Interestingly, this is a bit of an anecdote for Joao. One of the projects, I was on, a lot of this stuff began to, this sort of psychedelic turn of my work, which was not at all present in my recent work, my previous work, but it really began in our sabbatical year with Lisa Stevenson and I, my partner and also an anthropologist, in Ecuador in 2015, 2016. And this is something that Joao knows, but towards the end of that, that year, Lisa was working with Colombian refugees, and we decided to do a kind of theater workshop with them. And Cristiana Giordano, who is another anthropologist, came and began to. We did a really incredible transformative workshop. With Manari was also part of it. He came and did a healing ceremony for the people who have gone through tremendous violence. But anyways, there was a strange moment when. As we started thinking theatrically about space and things like that, I began to dream. I began to realize that the best way to. I began to dream very, very kind of spatially, and I realized I began drawing my dreams as a kind of a way to access some of that. So some of what you saw there were dreams, just dreams that of mine that are drawn. Then I began to. Then there were times I also with Manari I began taking tobacco, and sometimes I would have sort of remnant I would have visions of we call forest spirits, and some of those drawings are those kinds of things. Then I started using various technologies to understand to design this museum, and one of them was drawing some of the pieces. Some of those drawings were actually made in the field in the Amazon, when we had some of those pieces there. So that was some of the drawings are of that. Then there's another image in there, which is something from much further back. That circle is a kind of something I was doing back in the 90s in Ecuador. It's called Psychography. It's a form of Jungian form of writing, drawing, which you're disrupting certain kinds of senses of narrative. It becomes very embodied by actually drawing with two hands. So you're not trying to represent something, but you're trying to work through things. And that was one of the drawings. So that's sort of part of the drawing part. But this is part of a series of different kinds of technologies that we're developing, to do this. And writing has been the most important one, because it's the place that it seems that. The first project was I received a kind of almost frantic call from Sarayaku, who were saying, we're going to Paris in a few weeks, and we would like you to help us with a document that we're going to present on the living forest. And I worked with them for these intense, wonderful seminars, basically like a university seminar where we would sit down and really argue out ideas, and I would be sort of the channel for that. And they had a lot of things written, and so it was really a question of really clarifying and condensing something and making it, sort of giving it maximal impact. And then Manari and the Zapata Nation got wind of this, and they're like, hey, wait a second, can we do something like this with you? But it was much more open. It wasn't, how we were going to do it was what became much more interesting. And that's when a kind of writing in which going to the community, hanging out, taking psychedelics was very much part of it, and the writing part of it was done in Quito, but always before sunrise. And I would always take tobacco before writing, and I would write this thing. And then Manari, he comes back and forth between Quito and his community, and when he was in Quito, he and his partner would come over to our house. Everyone was still sleeping, but at 4 a.m, and we would drink guayusa. It's a kind of a tea that people drink, and we would discuss the document, and I would read it to him, and he would sort of, listen to it, and then he would listen to what the spirits had to say, and then he would take this document to the Amazon and do ceremonies and try to think through And then he would come back and we would discuss things, and he was like, some things the spirits didn't like, and we kind of changed it. Sometimes we were kind of pushing them a bit on stuff, and that was the nature of that. And this became, I think the thing about that is that writing itself is already shamanic. It's not so much that, this is not we're making conscious something that is already happening as we write and create, all of us. And it's an interesting moment because, I expressed that once. Manati, resonates with the fact that writing is my shamanic mode. It's my form of entering into a kind of spirit world and doing kind of work, going up and coming down. And I think this, speaks a little bit to what this thing is that is a forest. I, in some sense, literally mean a forest, and I literally mean an Amazonian forest. But I also mean that it's any kind of situation in which there's a kind of, we as living beings, and I'm not sure what to say about asteroids, and I don't think that, right now I still am sort of limited to life as sort of we know it, even though I can say something about the formal contours of a life beyond our planet. But my point is that there are all these situations in which we can have a kind of a guidance from something by entering into another kind of a dimension. And I just want to just take a moment to show you something, a little show and tell that might help understand this. There's this guy who, there's a Princeton-trained mathematician named Tadashi who specializes in the mathematics of toys. He's a professor at Stanford, and he has this YouTube thing that I think is very relevant to this. I'm not sure he does, though. So here's the problem, and this is just a way to sort of try to, here's the problem. So here's a piece of paper with a square, right? And the problem is that you want to try to get this through, but it doesn't fit, right? It's just kind of impossible. So what he suggests is that you can do a kind of topological trick to this to make this work. And what you do is you take this paper and you fold it down like this, and then you kind of enter into another dimension. You move up into another dimension, in this case like a third dimension, and all of a sudden you get a kind of opening, and then you collapse back into the dimension you were back in, and then you can just simply then pass this through. Sorry. Right? So the point here, I don't know if this is, I wrote him a long email about this and what my theories are. He didn't respond, which I think is, but the point is that I'm not sure this is fully just a metaphor. Like there's something about life that necessarily partakes in a generality that informs it and that we can access. And that I think all life, all common person's life necessarily has to have this kind of shamanic component. That is what life is. To be able to access at some moments, however rare, a sense that somehow you can sort of see, you can get into another mode by which you can then come back and resolve something in the mundane world of this kind of two dimension. So I don't want to diss on trees, but there's something about trees seem to be these kind of like inert, they don't move, for example. But they sort of, they can get up into this kind of space, into the third dimension, it's not a third dimension, into some other dimension, and then come back and resolve a problem. And that's exactly what, if in a nutshell, what I'm after here is to say that kind of move is both essential to life, but it's essential to politics. It's essential to, this is not just ontology, let's just look at crazy things and show you that they're real. No, it's, let's think about how that is related, how that may be a source for guidance. And once you have that source for guidance, then you can do something, and then you have an obligation to do something, and that takes work. So all those things are connected. And I think, I don't know what to say about ayahuasca and the various uses that it's being used in many places. And I've only taken the ayahuasca in forests. At some general level, I think that psychedelics, not just ayahuasca, but all the other ones, they're most, the ones that I think the things that are being used more in therapeutic settings are DMT and psilocybin and things like that. They have this general self-breaking in order to remake mode. And I'm staying close to the ethnography to show that that actually can relate to the other than human. Now, of course, what we do with these things, I've learned so much from ayahuasca, and I've forgotten so much of what I've learned. It requires real work. Again, to say it in a very general sense, political work, actual effort to make these things actually happen. But again, the world, the ethnographic world of its use in all of these communities outside of forest is obviously very important, and I don't know so much about it.
Okay, so we had Gabriela in the back, right? And then we have Serena, and then Jamili. Okay.
Gabriela first.
Gabriela. Okay. Great.
But it's related to what Joao mentioned about Tao's work, because I can see the connections, but I also see the difference that I cannot have a clear picture of how to distinguish between them. So I thought about the role of the mimetic, or mimesis, of mimicking. At times I thought that maybe these rituals involve some form of mimicking the other, mimicking nature, or especially because you gave us the example, showed the example of the insect that becomes like the leaf.
Yeah.
But I also remember that in the more recent work by Tausig, he's very influenced by surrealism, you know. Mm-hmm. And one of his points is that actually there is not such a big difference between primitive, quote unquote, primitive thinking or magic thinking and modernity. And that will go against this ecological thinking, because there is in your work there seems to be a tension or a contradiction between our way, quote unquote, our or modern ways of thinking or Western ways of thinking and primitive thinking. Am I going in the right direction?
No, you're going the right way. I mean,
okay. I just wanted you to talk a little about that.
That's great. Yeah.
Okay, so we go Jamili now, and then we go Serena there. Great.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a great question.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. That was beautiful. So I wanted to share two experiences very briefly that we had at the University of São Paulo, and that involved like how can we actually incorporate rituals and even substances in academic practice. Mm-hmm. Like we had the last Anthropology of Science and Technology meeting in Brazil, and we have a mutual friend, actually, Peter Skavish. He was there with us. Sure. And the Californian witch Starhawk.
Yeah, I heard about that.
You heard about that?
Yeah, I heard about that event.
So in lieu of a reception, we had a ceremony with Starhawk. And it was amazing, like having at for those of you who have been to the University of São Paulo, it was at IEB, the Institute for Brazilian Studies. We had a big circle, and that's what closed the schedule, the academic schedule for the day. And it was really like a groundbreaking experience for all of us who were there. And the second experience that I wanted to mention was an event organized by the Anthro department there called Lições de Fala, so Lessons of Speech. Mm. That was closed with a ceremony of conducted by a Hunikuin shaman. Mm. And we had like Sananga eye drops, and we had tobacco snuff, rapé. Mm-hmm. And with the faculty and grad students and people who were visiting. So having said that, I feel that it's becoming more and more like standard in Brazilian academia to approach psychedelics or rituals and ceremonies as a form of study, as a form of research, and I think that resonates with what you were saying. And which brings me to the following question: like, how do you feel in Canada and in the U.S.? How is this being received? Like, what you're proposing?
Okay. That's great.
Great, everybody helps.
You need to bring those experiences to Brazil lab.
Not so sure. Not so sure.
The parent in the house here is getting worried.
There are other ways of horizoning making.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
If I could just add another question, thinking with a forest from a perhaps analogic space to Amazonia, which is a tropical rainforest on a mountain in Mozambique. So my first question is, what if you could talk a little bit about your techniques of creating the soundscape?
Mm-hmm.
So if that was something along the lines of recording and condensing time and putting sound together, if it was more reflecting, creating a density through layers of audio,
Yeah.
and what was the desired effect that you were going for? And I'm asking this because I think that you give a tremendous effect of a vitality, a lushness, a completeness, almost, this intact forest space. And so my experience, I spent the summer, a month, on a tropical rainforest, and we did a similar exercise of recording. And I'd mentioned to you that we took a lot of very powerful directional mics to try to get any kind of forest sound. So this was a forest where the trees exist. It looks very similar to the photographs you have, but because of different practices of trapping, various things that happened over time, keystone species from the ecology have dropped out. It doesn't sound the same. Also, people will tell you, the indigenous people who live there will tell you that the forest spirits left in 1952 when a Portuguese family came and taught them how to farm potatoes. So I'm mentioning this because I want to be able to think with that forest. I think that it is a forest world that thinks. It's thinking through ruination, it's thinking through contamination, it's thinking through loss. And then I keep contrasting that in my mind to this very vibrant space, almost a pristine space. So I want to think of the implications of that for the more transcendent ethics and politics that you're proposing through the ecological thinking.
So, yeah, and I realized I didn't, there's a bunch of stuff I didn't bring up. I didn't respond from the last round, and maybe I'll bring some of those things up. So this necklace is something that Manati asked me to wear when I talk about our work. So I try to honor that, and then I usually just keep it. I don't otherwise wear it. And just again linking. I guess I'll come back in a second to Gabriela's question, but just linking your question to Jorge's. So we got into this question of editing, shamanic editing of texts and creation of texts. And then when Manati came to Montreal, we presented this. We actually presented an earlier version of the Soundscape in that thing when I asked him to critique Philippe's work. And Lisa had made a film of a forest, of a rainforest, moving. It was actually from it was in a kind of eco lodge, and there was a kind of gondola, so you could like pan over through. I guess now with drones it doesn't look all that special, but it's pretty amazing. You're kind of flying through the forest. And she was going to put this together over the Soundscape so that we could to present. And she and Manati started editing this thing together. And the aesthetic principles that Manati was using were totally different from the aesthetic principles that we might use. And they were all about entering into, the waterfall was very important in this thing because that's where you enter in to have contact with the spirits. And so we created, Lisa Manati created a clip that was edited on these principles. And then Manati then continued to dream about that the following night, and things happened, and we all went into the portal, and he told us what the spirits were telling us, and he told me, what kinds of things I should be saying in talks. And those things make their ways into my talks. So that's some examples of this thing. Now, with that soundscape that we made, it's true. I mean, that I've been to his community many times, and it's overwhelming the amount of sonic things that are happening. And there was, and I've been in rainforests a lot, and I'm really into it. But there was one moment where I was like, I can't turn this off. I can't turn this off. Like, it is so. And it's true. There was an article in Science written relatively recently about, in certain kinds of forests, in forests in generally, animals will start exploring and occupying acoustic niches, and one sort of sign of a of a forest that has trouble is often that they're empty. These niches are sort of empty. But and so the Soundscape, just in general, was done over. We did several. We went to the community. We made all these recordings. We recorded them in many things, in many situations, including in ayahuasca ceremonies. All sorts of things happened, as I was saying. Then we made a quick. Fabiano made a quick demo because I was going to Paris and I wanted to play it in Paris, so he did that. But then this summer we went and really sat down and did the editing correctly. All three of us in the room. And Manati more or less sort of guiding things. And then we were identifying things that we still needed. Then Manati and I went back to the community, and now Manati also had a tape recorder, and he also began recording things, and I was recording things. And then we recorded what he wanted to do, which was I thought really interesting. The first thing we did, he said, how are we going to structure this? What we're going to do is we're going to use my shamanic chant that will be the way in which we can understand and call it things. And then we're going to pull it out. It won't be, no one will ever hear it. We'll just take it out. But we'll use it as the kind of structure. This was Manati's idea. I thought it was really brilliant to have this sort of absent sort of space of him opening up and closing it. But then that shifted, and what we did is we went back to the community, and he did a ceremony. It was specifically about this museum that we're creating. And that chant is what you heard. That's what. So the other thing I just want to say about your question is that I think again, it sort of goes to the question about ayahuasca in the forest or not. There's something really special about these tropical rainforests and these particular spaces that don't have a lot of intervention. But that is not, there's the danger of romanticizing that space and the other danger is that what we really have to work with is nature in ruins. And I think this is the great brilliance of the work of someone like Anat Singh, who shows you ways of listening and cultivating the art of listening in spaces that are highly destroyed. But it's not so much, I'm not so sure that the forest is thinking through loss, right? The forest what the forest to me is expressing is mind's manifestation in the form of mind. That's available anywhere where there's life. It's not, and it also, shamans will report, yes, the spirits are there is also expressing loss as well. But the sort of thing that Anna Singh wants to do is not to sort of say, let's listen to the loss that the forest tells us. Let's do something with what we have in the messy spaces. But I don't want to just be so quick about saying, let's just go with the mess, because I think conceptually we get really confused, with the kind of move towards just working with complex hybrid spaces. These are things that jump out and become manifest, and it's easier to do in a place like this, but we have to do it everywhere. To go to Gabriela's question, I think one of the things that's important here, and this is a big insight of mine that I've had in recent months, thinking with Manati, is going back to that example of him. It's like, I think, I love Tausig's work. I'm not sure he would say the same of me, but I really am a huge fan, because he really knows how to think in images. Every single book of his, not just in this, I Swear I Saw This, which is a brilliant book, but he thinks in pictures, and that's of course his attraction to surrealism and things like that. And to get that all thinking has this kind of thing. I think this is something that Tausig wrote in the article of. I don't think it made it into the book I Swear I Saw This, but in the article that was the basis for the book, he writes quite clearly. He probably has written it elsewhere that when you write, you're entering into the spirit world. And this is very much like the example I gave here. You go into this space of that has all this highly absential space, to come down and actually do things, right? That's a spirit, and it has all the elements of mimesis, that I can say something and it can be repeated and it can propagate and all these sorts of things. So to recognize that there's spirit life in every kind of, in the modern world, in modernity, in our gods, in the Christian God, in all the spaces that we know is all important. The question of that Manati poses, and the question that I want to pose, is how do we make ethical choices about the kinds of spirits that we want to capacitate, right? That was Manati's example of this thing. He's like, oh great, yeah, you got the spirits of this thing. Look, there's the spirits of destruction. Yeah, but we don't want to go there, right? And so I think what Manati's saying is like there are things that, and then so my question there is like, well, how do you understand something about the ethical that allows you to, something ontological about the ethical that allows you to make those kinds of choices, that is not just grounded in the kinds of worlds that are human. And then to Jamil's question, how is this being received? I don't know. I mean, Manati and I are going to present together the AAAs with Eat Skafish and Renata Stutzman. Yeah, we're presenting. I've organized a panel with some really interesting and vibrant a Métis scholar from Canada, a Paiute scholar, Manati, and Pete Skafish, who works on New Age channels, and Renata Stutzman, who's working on I think video in the Amazon. So we'll see. I don't know. I'm just starting to do this. I think that most of my colleagues are polite and they can't say much because I'm relatively successful, but they think it's really flaky and bad. I think. But then on the other hand, I think, as everyone is beginning to realize the centrality of the environmental, the ecological problem, I don't think there's a way out but to deal with these things.
Can we get one last round? So we have Justin, and while the microphone gets to Justin, I will ask, even though it might not hit. Okay. So it's so elegant, the conceptual work that you are doing and the way you are thinking about concept work, and it's also very erudite. And I just had a curiosity, and it's really in the spirit of really just of getting your imagination, your conceptual imagination. Could you do that work without peers now? Now that you're ready, peers already did a lot for you, and you did a lot with peers. Could you let peers go? And what would that do to the concept work? Okay, Justin. That's the other allergy, right?
So I had an ethnographic question about the taboos or prohibitions related to the consumption of ayahuasca among the group of people that you were studying. And I'm curious, so for example, in the ethnographic record, it appears as though while women, for example, may sometimes consume ayahuasca, it's primarily men who become these practitioners and who are able to achieve these heightened states of reality. And so if there's any sort of ethnographic prohibitions and taboos that are existing, does that have any implications for the sort of proposal of universalizing shamanic concept work in psychedelic science?
Can we have one more question there, in the back? Yes. Just wait a second. The micro.
So yes, I have a question related to your comment about peers, and it seems that it is very important for you in this stage of your research to focus on like your own visual production or these sonic projects. So I was wondering if you see a possibility to integrate your theory into more aesthetic reflections based on artistic production from the communities or from people that now are working from visual arts and music and are like intersecting shamanic practices and environmental perspectives, working on the Amazon and from the Amazon. into your own conception of the forest.
Okay. I mean, maybe I'll try to take that last question together with Joao's. I mean, I have this strange relationship with Peirce because every time I'm sure other people have this with other authors, but I just am constantly blown away by what I learn from him, and because I think he's developed a kind of mind manifesting trick. Because, for example, he's interested in, it's this double trick of not just it's this sense that the things the basic properties of the world structure both our exploration of that world and how we explore it. Now, of course, there are many places where we I mean, there are others who have done this, Gregory Bateson and Levi Strauss in some ways. But I just think that he's hit on something that time and again, I come to new insights. So I'm not really ready to not, if that's going well. I mean, all of those things that I talked about, abduction and ethical, are just new for me. It's so exciting to me that I can see this sort of thing I've been trying to work with, this, how do you ground this ethical and the non-human? I couldn't quite, it's like, here's one little piece. It doesn't get me too far, but I mean, the art, one of the things that I'm also trying to understand in a more larger thing is how I can enter into other kinds of conversations. And unfortunately, I haven't had the place where I get a lot of attention and people invite me is in the art and the architecture world. And sadly, because a lot of this stuff is I just have a very limited amount of time. I can come to Princeton because also my parents live here, and I can get here in an hour from Montreal. But there was an invitation to go to the Taipei Biennale, to Australia, to Korea. My book just came out in Korean. There's all sorts of conversations, especially in the art world with these biennales that it's a world I don't understand, and I know that I could learn a lot from that. And I think that's one of the places where I really want to go, but I don't. I just don't know how to grasp into that with the time constraints I have. Let's see. But then, of course, so that's then the question of taboos and prohibitions and things like that. Yes, this is a highly gendered. Ayahuasca use varies in different communities. In some places, children are also given ayahuasca. The entire communities can take it. In many places, it's mainly men, and then there are some very important exceptions to that. So it is a highly gendered practice that I have the privilege of partaking in. And again, I mean, universalizing is not a word in my vocabulary, so to be clear about that. I talk about generalizing, which is not the same thing. And what I'm interested in ayahuasca again is again not to say that just because I'm talking about a particular experience with a particular drug taken by particular people, in this case largely men. I don't think I want to be clear that does not mean that the general logic of emergence that it makes manifest is not available in other places to everyone, and it must be available in many kinds of the everyday practices that in your lab you'll be exploring. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, again, I think, it's that tacking back and forth between that, but I insist that manifestation is not a gendered thing, and it's not a male only thing. Although, of course, I mean, that is a part of domination, right? When certain people can have more or are more entitled to have ready access to creative emergence than others, that's a form of domination. So clearly.
And do you think you are rethinking somehow the figure of the shaman, which is so iconic in anthropology? If we think of Levi-Strauss, for example, yeah. The shaman as this cunning figure, right, who doesn't have to believe in the technique, but, and because Do you think of rethinking the shaman
Well, I mean,
as an ethical
I think
figure
that-
rather than the cunner who is
Yeah,
at the
I
mercy
mean-
of the gravitational field with individual and the group and the technology that he
Yeah, I
has?
mean, I guess I would, I don't take Levi-Strauss's take on the shaman in that classic essay to be, for me, what it's really about. I think it's really about this other thing of moving into more general planes. And my goal of that is to say, in a very real way, I mean, I often say this in my class in Montreal, my introduction, my 202 class, which is like 101, I guess. You know, I convince everyone, the introductory students, that they're all shamans, especially those who can like move between French and, many people are bilingual or even trilingual in Montreal, French and English. That's shamanic. It's truly a shamanic thing. And so, again, one of my goals, you know, the kind of cosmic diplomacy I'm after is taking a concept and actually, okay, people feel uncomfortable with the term shamanism. Well, let's not. No, I want to show you that you yourself are a shaman, and how and what. And so I'm trying to distort these terms in a certain way to work in that with that, and to show that anthropology is a form of shamanism, and that being human is a form of anthropology, which is inherently shamanic.
But haven't we lost that capacity, Eduardo? You know, to hear voices for them. And some people would say this is like at great peril for us as ethical subjects.
I mean, that is what Davi Kopenawa says. He says, whites have lost the ability to dream, and if they can dream, they do dream, but they dream, it's a really interesting critique of psychoanalysis. If they dream, they only think about themselves, or maybe they dream about their close relatives, or you know, partners or something, but that's not what dreaming is about. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, yeah, I mean, I think there is a danger of losing, you know, I think there's some need to, you know, I think there's that part of the way of out of this. I mean, it's a simple thing. Is that our technologies for being able to jump out and see things from a more general point of view and go into the specifics. And that's our sense of a kind of ability to do abductions, which is how we're going to think our way out of this and do our way out of this mess we're in.
Eduardo, we cannot thank you enough. You touched us deeply. Incredibly inspiring work. Your resistance, refusal of closure, your surrendering to the open, the unknown, the cosmic. We can name it as we desire. But it's definitely an incredible epistemic, political, ethical challenge and an incredible aesthetic treat as well. We are deeply, deeply grateful for you. Thank you.
Thank you.